courtroom was full the morning Daniel Mercer walked in carrying a manila folder, a yellow legal pad, and nothing else.
No briefcase. No asociate.
No one whispering strategy into his ear. He wore a gray suit that had been pressed carefully the night before, the kind of pressing that takes more time than it should because the iron was old and the man using it needed something to do with his hands at 11 o'clock at night when his daughter was asleep and the apartment was too quiet to think straight. The opposing counsel was a woman named Victoria Sloan, 44 years old, senior partner at Sloan and Hargrove, 17 years of family law. She had won 91% of her contested custody cases. She charged $850 an hour and had never once lost sleep over a client's folder because she had people for that. When she saw Daniel settle into the chair across from her, she leaned toward her associate, said something quietly, and both of them smiled. The bailiff noticed. The court reporter noticed. The judge's clerk, a young man named Patrick who had worked that courtroom for 3 years, noticed and looked away. The way people look away from things they find uncomfortable to witness. Nobody in that room knew what Daniel Mercer had done for 11 years before the worst 18 months of his life had taken everything from him. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 4 hours changes the lives of every person in that room. And the lesson it leaves behind is one that Victoria Sloan will carry for the rest of her career. Daniel's apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Clement Street was the kind of place that worked harder than it looked. The walls were plain. The furniture was second-hand but solid. The kitchen window faced east, which meant the light came in early and strong, and Daniel had arranged the breakfast table to catch it directly, because his daughter, Lily, had once mentioned that mornings felt better when the sun was already there when she sat down. He had not forgotten that. Lily was 8 years old and possessed of a seriousness that occasionally alarmed people who did not know her well. She did not chatter. She observed. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of going very still when something required her full attention. She kept a small notebook on the kitchen table. Not for drawing. For questions. Things she wrote down and intended to ask later, when the moment was right. That morning, while Daniel poured her orange juice and checked the time with the quiet efficiency of a man managing more variables than he showed, she opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote one word. Winning. Then she looked up. Is winning the same as being right? She asked. Daniel set the glass down in front of her. He thought about it the way he thought about most of Lily's questions, not quickly and not dismissively, but with the particular attention of a man who understood that the questions children ask in kitchens are often the most important questions anyone ever asks anywhere. Sometimes, he said, but being right matters even when you don't win. Lily considered this, wrote something else in the notebook, and closed it. He packed her bag for school. He double-checked the permission slip for her class trip that was sitting on the counter with a sticky note he had written to himself 48 hours ago. He tied his tie standing in the hallway mirror, the motions automatic, the eyes somewhere else entirely. The custody hearing had been scheduled for 9 months. Lily's mother, Rachel, had filed 14 months ago, 3 months after she remarried and relocated to a house 40 minutes outside the city with a man named Gregory who worked in pharmaceutical sales and owned a boat he used twice a year. Rachel's position, as articulated in the original filing and every document since, was that Daniel's current financial situation made him an unstable primary custodian. Her attorney was Victoria Sloan. Daniel was representing himself. Not because he didn't understand the risk. Not because he was proud or reckless or hadn't been told, clearly and more than once, that self-representation in contested custody proceedings was statistically one of the worst decisions a person could make. He was representing himself because he was the only one who knew everything, and because some arguments, he had decided, needed to be made by the person who actually lived them. He kissed the top of Lily's head before she left for the neighbor's care. She held onto his sleeve for exactly 2 seconds longer than usual, then let go without a word, the way children hold on when they have decided to be brave about something. He picked up his manila folder and his legal pad and walked out into the morning. Family Court Department 12 was smaller than people imagined when they thought about courtrooms. No gallery.
No dramatic architecture.
Fluorescent light, pale carpet, and the low hum of a ventilation system that worked inconsistently. Judge Carol Whitmore had presided over it for 9 years. She was precise, efficient, and had a particular intolerance for wasted time that was known throughout the building and respected by everyone except people who had never appeared before her before. Victoria Sloan had appeared before her 11 times. Daniel Mercer had never appeared before anyone. The hearing opened with procedural motions. Sloan moved through them the way a surgeon moves through a familiar incision, clean, fast, without looking at the blade. She spoke in the clipped, structured cadence of someone who had made these arguments so many times that the words had become a kind of muscle memory, reliable and automatic. When it was Daniel's turn to respond to the first motion, he stood, placed both hands on the table, and spoke in a voice that was calm and even and did not rush. He cited 3 cases. He cited them by name, by year, by jurisdiction, and by the specific holding he intended to apply. He cited the relevant section of the California Family Code. He asked the court to note the page number in the exhibit binder he had prepared and submitted the previous Thursday. There was a pause. Judge Whitmore looked at the binder, then at Daniel, then at the binder again. Sloan's associate leaned forward almost imperceptibly. The motion was denied. Sloan did not change expression. She moved to the next item. But something had shifted in the room, the way pressure shifts before weather changes, noticeable only to people paying close attention. The second motion concerned Daniel's income documentation. Sloan presented it precisely as she had written it in the filing, that Daniel's current employment as a legal aid at a non-profit organization represented insufficient and unstable income to meet the standard of primary custodian for a child of Lily's age and needs. She referenced his departure from previous employment. She referenced the gap in his professional record. She described it, in the particular language of family court filings, as a pattern of instability. Then she paused, and in that pause, said something that was not in any document. Something she said quietly enough to be conversational, but not quietly enough to be private. Your Honor, I've been doing this for 17 years. I've sat across from a lot of well-meaning people who've decided to handle this themselves. She glanced toward Daniel with something that stopped just short of pity. It rarely ends well for them. Or for the children. Someone near the back of the room made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. Judge Whitmore did not react visibly, but her eyes moved to Daniel. And Daniel, who had not moved, who had not changed expression, who had been sitting with the particular stillness of a man who had decided before he walked in that nothing said in this room would move him off the ground he had chosen, picked up his legal pad and began to write something down. Not a reaction. A note to himself. He knew exactly what was coming next. He had known for 9 months. What Victoria Sloan did not know, what no one in that room knew except Daniel, was that the gap in his professional record was not a gap at all. It was a decision. And the story behind that decision was about to become the most important exhibit in the entire proceeding. Daniel stood when the judge indicated it was his turn to address the income question. He did not begin with the income question. He began 11 years earlier. He spoke without notes for the first 4 minutes. Not because he was performing, but because the facts were his and he had lived with them long enough that they had become part of his structure, the way load-bearing walls become part of a building, invisible until you need them. He had graduated from UC Berkeley School of Law in the top 8% of his class. He had clerked for the Honorable James Okafor of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for 2 years. He had joined Hargrove and Associates. He paused here for exactly 1 beat, as a junior associate in their family law division in 2011. Sloan's associate stopped writing. Sloan herself went very still. Hargrove and Associates was the predecessor firm to Sloan and Hargrove. Victoria Sloan had joined as a senior associate in 2013, 2 years after Daniel. He had trained her, not directly, not one-on-one, but he had been the associate who built the case preparation templates that the firm still used. He had written the internal research guide for custody proceedings that junior associates received on their first day. He had been in that building doing that work at a level of competence that the partners had noted repeatedly in his annual reviews, for 3 years before a morning in February changed everything. He placed a document on the table, his associate bar record, active for 11 years, voluntarily placed on inactive status 18 months ago. He placed a second document, his performance reviews from his time at Hargrove and Associates. He did not read from them. He simply submitted them. He placed a third document, a letter written on the letterhead of the Honorable James Okafor, United States Circuit Judge. Not a form letter. A specific, detailed letter written at Daniel's request 6 weeks ago, describing his analytical capabilities, his character, and his conduct during their 2 years of work together. Then he addressed the income question directly. He had placed his law license on inactive status 18 months ago because Rachel had left with Lily and he had needed immediate work with predictable hours, work that ended when it ended, work that would let him be home at the same time every evening. The nonprofit paid less. That was a fact. It was also a choice. A deliberate, documented, considered choice made in the interest of the child whose custody was currently under discussion. He had remained in that position while preparing this case, because preparing this case had been his full-time second job for 9 months. He sat down. The ventilation system hummed. Judge Whitmore was looking at the letter from Judge Okafor with an expression that had changed in a way that was difficult to name precisely but impossible to miss. Sloan asked for a 10-minute recess. It was granted. The hearing resumed with a different quality to the air. Sloan was composed. She was always composed. But the argument she made in the second half of the hearing was a different argument than the one she had prepared. It was smaller, more careful. It acknowledged things the original filing had not acknowledged. Daniel responded to each point the way he had responded to everything that morning. Methodically, without theater, with the particular authority of someone who is not trying to impress anyone, only to be accurate. At 1:14 in the afternoon, Judge Whitmore called a recess before delivering her findings. She returned 11 minutes later. Primary physical custody was awarded to Daniel Mercer, with a structured visitation schedule for the mother. The decision was read clearly, specifically, and without ambiguity. Then Judge Whitmore did something that Patrick, the clerk who had worked that courtroom for 3 years, would later say he had never seen her do before. She set down the document she was reading from. She looked directly at Daniel over the top of her glasses. And she said, in a voice that was still judicial but contained something that had not been in the room all morning, Mr. Mercer, the court wants to acknowledge that you prepared and presented this case with a level of rigor and care that this courtroom sees rarely, if ever, from represented parties, let alone from someone proceeding on their own behalf. The court also wants to note, for the record, that certain remarks made earlier in this proceeding, while not improper in a technical sense, were beneath the standard this court expects. I should have addressed them at the time. I did not. I am addressing them now. She looked briefly towards Sloan's table, then back to Daniel. Your daughter is fortunate, she said, and then she picked up her document again, and the hearing was closed. Daniel sat in the parking structure for a few minutes before he started the car. Not because he was overwhelmed, not because he needed to collect himself, but because there is a particular kind of quiet that follows the end of something you have worked toward for a very long time, and he had learned in the past 18 months to let that quiet exist without filling it. He picked Lily up from the neighbors at 3:40. She was waiting at the door with her backpack already on and her notebook in her hand. She looked at his face the way she looked at most things, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. Did we win? She asked. Yes, he said. She nodded, opened the notebook, looked at the word she had written that morning. Winning. She wrote something underneath it, then turned the notebook so he could see. Same as right this time. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took her hand and they walked to the car together in the late afternoon light, and the city moved around them the way cities move around people who have just come through something. Indifferent, continuous, and somehow right then exactly right. Daniel Mercer did not go back to the courtroom as a lawyer. Not immediately. Not because he couldn't, but because Lily had a class trip the following Friday and there was a permission slip on the counter at home with a sticky note on it, and some things he had decided were more important than the next chapter. The next chapter would come. It always did. If the story stayed with you, it's because you already know something Daniel knew the night before that hearing, pressing a suit with an old iron in a quiet apartment, that the most powerful thing a person can bring into any room is simply everything they actually are. Subscribe. Because every week, we tell the stories of people who refuse to be invisible.